The Spirit is upon me, anointed me, to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of Jubilee and the day of reckoning, to comfort all who mourn, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of God. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. And God bless the reading of this sacred word. Susie, I'm going to invite you to come forward and talk to us about your journey, your walk. Now, I heard Susie talk 2 years ago when I was at Manual College. She was our preacher for the day on Wednesday worship, and I was just blown out of the water at what she had to say. You had just come back from, I think it was the Red Dress Initiative, maybe, she says. And although she's not talking about that today, the subject about abuse of women, the abuse of Indigenous women and girls as well. And so Susie, when I thought of you for a fresh start, I thought, yeah, bring the wisdom to us.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me this morning. As we gather here, I want to acknowledge that we gather on the traditional territory of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, and acknowledge the current caretakers of this territory, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. I also want to bring you greetings from my own faith community, which is the Church of the Holy Trinity, and from the Shining Waters Regional Council staff, where I'm a member of the staff team. As we talk today about the experience of missing and murdered Indigenous women, I just want to acknowledge at the beginning that this topic is disturbing, which seems like an obvious thing to say. But I want to invite you or remind you that if there's a part of your own experience that touches this kind of grief or violence, I encourage you to take care of yourself as you need to move around, to focus on something else, to stand up and step out of the room, to reach out, or to talk to me later. I brought a few shawls here on the front seat, just if you want something, also a bit of comfort around your shoulders. It seems silly to say this in church, but we don't often remember to kind of take care of ourselves as we're present to some of these difficult issues and stories. So I want to say that out loud. My grandmother, Beatrice, is a descendant of the Red River Métis. Her great-great-great-great-grandmother was a woman whose name sounded like Penachikwe to the English ear. Penachikwe was a Cree woman described as the helpmate of a man who was the factor of a Hudson Bay post on James Bay in 1779. And together they had 7 children. In my family tree, these relationships branched out through many generations across the prairies and into the Red River Valley. But in the time from Penachikwe to Beatrice, Indigenous people were displaced from their land, severed from their culture and language, separated from their children, and impacted by starvation policies. For the details, see the other 3 branches of my family story. But by the time my grandmother was born, being Métis was something to hide and to leave in the past, to escape the racism in the city of Winnipeg and its institutions. So I share this as a sign to say that the story of missing and murdered Indigenous women today begins in the story of colonization. So where there's new attention and hopefully new commitment towards addressing these issues, the violence at the root of this story is not new. I don't know where your mind goes when you hear the now too common phrase, missing and murdered, maybe to Vancouver's downtown east side, which is where some of this recent chapter had its origin. I grew up in Winnipeg, where when I was 7, Helen Betty Osborne was a young Cree woman from Norway House who was studying in Nepaw, Manitoba, who hoped to become a teacher, who was picked up by 4 men, assaulted, and murdered. She was stabbed 50 times and left in the bush where she died. The investigation was dropped, although it said that many people in the community knew the truth, but nothing was done for 16 years. In the end, only one of the 4 white men involved was convicted. Helen's murder sparked an Aboriginal justice inquiry that found the main factors in the case were racism, sexism, and indifference. We know now that there are more than hundreds documented, and many more continue to go unlisted, unreported, or uninvestigated. Today, Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely to experience violence than non-Indigenous women. The report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, released this year, describes a deliberate race and identity gender-based genocide. In a terrible twist of the story, at the end of the day, it's the women themselves who get blamed for this violence. The media scrutinizes where people were and what they were doing and questions the quality of their character. As one author put it, these women are framed for their own murders. The inquiry report clearly documents the situation today of over-criminalization and under-protection. The most powerful experience I've had in connecting to the heart of this struggle is through the commemorative art ceremony called Walking with Our Sisters. Walking with Our Sisters began with one woman sitting in compassion for another woman's loss. In the winter of 2012, Métis artist Christy Belcourt found herself with the image of a young missing woman that she had seen on Facebook, and it was lodged in her spirit. She'd been missing for years, this girl. But as a mother herself, Christy tried to imagine what this young woman's mother was going through, what unspeakable worry and grief she must feel. Christy put out a call to families in this situation to find an artful way to arrange, and committed to find an artful way to arrange what they gave her. And she invited them to send the beaded tops of moccasins, which are called vamps. She said that they should be unfinished to represent these lives that were cut short, unfinished lives. By the summer of that same year, she had received almost 1,800 pairs of vamps that had clearly tapped deep into a need. Christy says, I thought at the beginning, when I first made the call out for vamps, that Walking with Our Sisters was an art exhibit. It isn't. It's a commemoration. It's a ceremony. It's an honoring. It's a way to demonstrate that we care. It's compassion that guides it, nothing else. And it has no other purpose except for communities to come together, to hold ceremony, and to honor the lives of missing and disappeared sisters, and to support family members who attend. Walking with Our Sisters is not an organization. It's merely a collection of caring souls. I was present in Toronto when the vamps arrived, and I was overwhelmed by the care that was taken, even unloading the truck. 2 elders sang and drummed songs as the boxes were passed lovingly along the line of volunteers into the space that we would create. They said that we were offering the spirits a bit of sweetness that they were denied, thank you, at the end of their life. The lodge that we set up was set up with the same amount of care before people came to walk through and to pay their respects. There was a space offered for spiritual care alongside the memorial, and there were lots of instructions about how we were to take care of the space given by the grandmothers, including at the end of the day, we stopped to sing these lovely lullabies on the drum. Each day, people were cared for by a team of volunteers, and For some of the family and friends of women who came, it was the only funeral that they ever had. I was so struck by the power of the work as a whole. When you're met by the sight of more than 1,000 moccasins, the loss of life is staggering. But the act of bringing them together, of collecting all these individual stories and drawing them into one bundle, it felt like bringing them home in the best way that we could do. Let's take a little turn to the prophet Isaiah. I've heard this reading from Isaiah many times before, that big call to justice that restores right relations. The oppressed, the brokenhearted, the captives, they receive the gifts. The good news, the liberty, the release. That part I heard, but until recently, I had missed the last bit of this message. That part that says, they will be called the oaks of righteousness, the planting of God. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities. Who are they? They are the mourners. The mourners are the actors. They build, they raise, they repair. Remember and act, mourn and organize. The liberative thing here is planted in the sorrow. I want to be clear that I'm not reading intention here into tragedy of our lives to say that God gives these things so we can make ourselves stronger or make the world a better place. Far from it. I think that God's heart breaks with each loss. The part I want to lift up is that the people with the lived experience of losses, who are all of us, can act to bring change. Mourning is bound together with transformation. So what does it say about our current situation? Well, first of all, it speaks to the big stuff in the vision of the prophet. That's what's carried forward by Jesus, this transformative message of change. In every report that's been written on this topic, and there are many, I brought one with me today, there's ample documentation of what's needed, what's required to restore right relations. There's 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's 221 calls for justice into the inquiry of missing and murdered Indigenous women. That's a good enough list to start with. Second, I'd say that there's a call to create from the ruins, and that remembering is the work of our hands and our hearts. This lesson was loud and clear in the handiwork of those beaded pieces that were strung together, then strung together stories that would not be lost. In the designs themselves, the traditional teachings of Indigenous people spoke. There were flowers and birds and strawberries. One of my friends said that she saw every story that she'd ever heard represented in the lodge as she walked through. Across the generations, at beading circles and at kitchen tables, sisters were remembered, as well as a traditional way of working was passed on. These kind of artful acts of memory help to mend the world. Finally, I hear the call of the prophet asking us to take mourners seriously and to center the experience of families of missing and murdered women. That's not usually how it goes. But it is the mourners who will lead the way forward. And that is the place where we connect also to this story. Walking with our sisters wrapped up the final ceremonies this summer of their installation. But it does linger on in the relationships that were formed there. And it offers a legacy of a way of working that offers compassion, that holds out for the big change, for transformative change, but that also inspires creativity and links mourning with organizing. Thank you for listening today. I've stuck to my text to try and stick to 10 minutes, but I'm happy to talk with you about this later or at another time. And I ask your prayers for our country as we move this story forward. And I ask you to open your own heart to the brokenhearted among us so that we can make a different future for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. some important figures you gave us there about the numbers, and the numbers that aren't even reported. So hopefully families are now stepping forward and reporting their missing or murdered relatives. Susie has left us with 3 questions, I think, for this morning. Something to think about. What is your overall response to what she just said? If you don't mind, Susie, that would be great. What is our connection to these stories? Maybe you know of someone who's gone through this. Or just what impact does it have when you hear about this happening in our own nation? And then how can communities help bear witness? Create space for remembering practices like this one that they created. I know when Susie sent me her PowerPoints earlier or last week, and I was going through them, when I got to this image of, I think it's the walk, and they laid out the 1800 vamps, I took a moment and said, how can this happen? And I sat and prayed for a good 10 minutes. Prayed for all those lost souls. For all those families who have someone missing, who will never return home. A life gone. It's a heavy subject. What is our overall response? Maybe you have one that you just want to keep within inside yourself as you're thinking about this as well.
I guess one of my overriding questions is why.
You just speak right here.
Maybe one of my questions is why? Why are Indigenous women targeted like this? I mean, I believe the statistics as leave on the news, but why is this continuing?
It's a good question, and I think there's lots of reasons.
I know it's not a one answer.
Racism is one of them, right? That there's a sense of availability and that lives don't matter as much. That's what they, if you read any of the stories about Helen Betty Osborne, who was a young woman studying to become a teacher, just picked up off the side of the road. So there is a larger set of ideas in society that somewhere says that's okay. And then when nothing happens about it, it says that's okay again. The vulnerabilities in communities are real, right? So people are living in situations that make them have less access to services and things like that. There's a little video I saw on Facebook on Thursday that the United Church put out around Thursdays in Black, where they have a regular practice on Thursdays to witness against the violence experienced by Black women. And one of the points that they brought out when someone said, why is that the case? Even when we create access to services, is that people don't necessarily we create services, but people don't necessarily access them because they're worried that when they do, what they experience is, either a sense of this didn't happen, or it was your fault, or all the things that get kind of tied onto that. So it just helped me think about even sometimes our first level of response, which is to kind of set up some community supports, don't always hit the mark. Which to me, it brings us back to that center of family's experience, right? Is to listen. The answer to your question is in the stories of some of those families, which are hard to hear, right? And they don't all come out in such a way that gives us a list of things to do. But it's a good question. In this report, the National Inquiry, it's part of the reason that it looks like this. This is volume 1. and there's another one, right? So, and it starts to dig into what's going on.
Were the families afraid to go to the police to report a missing member?
Sometimes. I mean, sometimes there is a lack of policing in those situations if we're talking about communities that are far from, centers. So, sometimes there's certainly a lot of question about the role of policing in this report. So sometimes they're afraid to. Sometimes, their reports are not followed up. One of the things that is happening in terms of reporting is the communities are organizing themselves. So there is a Facebook group now that's Walking with Our Sisters that sort of shares the stories of people who are missing. And some of the families have created a little video to say, what do you do when this happens, when your child doesn't come home or your auntie is not, you can't get in touch with her. And they've actually come up with some practical things, ways to make a report, ways to notify law enforcement, ways to kind of put out messages. Like, there's actually been some community organizing with people themselves trying to increase the chances that something happens at the time someone is missing, right?
Being in Toronto, I feel like it's been sort of a problem that the government should be here, that it's a problem, and I want to ask you, what is something beyond prayer, which I agree, what is something that we can do about this?
I ask myself that question. I mean, as a person who wants to be involved, and also as a staff person who tries to engage other people. And one of the things that I have chosen for myself is to support Indigenous-led advocacy. So there's a couple of opportunities in Toronto around this issue in particular. The Native Resource Centre does a vigil every year in October in Allen Gardens. That includes kind of a community gathering and things like that. And then every Valentine's Day, there's an elder in Toronto, Wanda Whitebird, who gathers the families of missing and murdered women for a ceremony at the police headquarters on Bay Street. And the last few years I've been going, I didn't even know about this, and I've been involved in this work for a long time. But when you go there are not a lot of white people there. It is not our thing. It's a thing that clearly is about the families, and they have a strawberry ceremony, which is a bit funny in February, but it's about kind of connecting to the heart, and they share also a little water ceremony as a way of kind of connecting to healing and life. And then they invite people to speak. So some people stand up and sort of say what's going on. So it's a very different feeling of being in a situation that's not hosted by us, but being present to it. And they kind of transformed this place outside the police station into this, creating a space of remembrance, and I think kind of creating those spaces where we remember names and hear the stories and listen to people who are experiencing this stuff, just to be present is hard, and it's a bit hard to find your way in, but it really matters, right? There's all kinds of other work that I'm much more familiar with in terms of doing education or helping raise money or set up services. That's all there too. And in the report, there's a million different options of where people could connect into, repairing the bigger situation. But I find the hardest part is just trying to be in that space and if that was, it should be different, right? Everyone should be at a space like that. And it's not the case, right? It's still very unusual. And people are asked to come without their organizational banners or anything, just come and be present. So there is invitation, but we're just beginning to figure that out, I think.
I was struck by the parallel with Remembrance Day. crosses. I saw an image this year that I had never seen before. We're used to the crosses, row on row on row.
Yes.
I saw an image where they had taken boots, army boots,
Yes.
and they had them row on row
Yes.
on row. And I thought it was just sort of a gimmick, but I saw that they'd also done it at Billy Bridge.
Yeah.
And it's a very visceral thing to see the boots. And now it was shown this, and I realized how very moving it is to see that, because you do identify a person with that much nature.
There's a church in Calgary that had a whole thing of poppies outside their wall, and it cascaded down the wall, thousands of them, right? So it created this space in public space that said, kind of, this is what's missing. And in that way, I feel like when we start to connect our losses, you can feel the difference, right? It feels like we are present. But to me, that's why we go from this reading that speaks about creating a space for mourning, which we don't do very well either, right? So I think connecting that part of our story in as parents, as women, as aunties, is the place. One of my friends says reconciliation is loving each other's children. And I actually think, that's where we aim, right? So it is that story, regardless of what situation.
What was that date in February again?
Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day, the strawberries in the water outside of the police headquarters
Yeah, it's
downtown.
headquartered for lunchtime.
Not much. In fact, that was the what you had just come from to talk to us about at Emmanuel.
That's
that
right.
triggered
Yeah,
that.
that's right.
Yeah, that was very impactful. So thank you. Words of hope. What does the Indigenous community want to? Where is the hope that they see in all this?
Well, I think it is in some of these kinds of movements, right? So Christy Belcourt, who's the artist who initiated this project, you may have seen her work. She has a stained glass window in the Parliament building. She's a very famous artist, but she spends a lot of her time organizing and mobilizing in communities and bringing people together to recapture beadwork, for people to talk to each other. And what's interesting about this event is it's not Indigenous only, it's Indigenous led. So the call to people to be involved went out to everyone. And the invitation was kind of wide open. So it was very interesting. So there were communities of Latina women. There was a whole circle of Black women who came and sang these songs from Soweto to them and said, "We're here with you." And it was a very interesting space that was welcome, but the leadership was clearly Indigenous. So it had that dimension to it, but the invitation was broad, which kind of still strikes me that there still is invitation, right? But there is, and that to me is an incredibly hopeful space. So, I chose to get involved by cooking, which is a thing that I can do. And I found that continually I was invited to come into the lodge, into the center space, and not just be in the kitchen. So come in for the opening and closing ceremony. At one point they brought in a group of young girls, and one of the young women who was taking them in said, "Would you come with me? Because I would just like someone else to be with me as we invite these young people through." So I continually found myself overwhelmed with invitations to come in deeper when I chose a role that was really kind of at the behind the scenes. And that to me is a hopeful thing, that we still can find the patterns of these beads, and we know drum song lullabies is a super hopeful thing, right? So now there are all kinds of places where some of that has a bit more spark and fire, right? Which is more reason to live as well. So